This is House Planning Help, episode 151. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Janet Cotterell from CTT Sustainable Architecture. She's the project architect on our second case study in the hub, but also behind the HPH151 timber frame system that they're using. So we're going to be hearing how the designs for Buckinghamshire Passivhaus came about and get an update on what's happening on site. But first, this podcast is all about low energy buildings. Yes, we know that. And if you've listened to it for any amount of time, you probably get it. You understand insulation, air tightness, and making sure the ventilation's all sorted too. But what if you're trying to communicate this to your better half, to your husband, to your wife, or maybe even to the kids, to your son or daughter, or someone who lives next door? You just want it at a level that will keep them interested, convey the key concepts. And that's why I want to share with you a piece of work that we've done at Regen Media. We were working for Archetype and we've just launched a video for them. The brief for this was actually almost slightly different because we were trying to create a training stroke induction video to help newcomers of the school understand what the school was all about and things that they would have to do, which actually in a passive house turns out to be not a lot unless you're the facilities manager. So what we ended up doing was explaining a lot of the passive house concepts behind it. And as we reflect on this video now, it's just a great overview of low energy buildings. And it's all conveyed by the kids too, because they're the ones leading us through this process. So a lot of the work we do at Regen Media is case studies and quite factual. This is a drama, so completely different. I'd love it if you could go and check this out. And well done to Joseph, Mia, Michael and Tia from Wilkinson Primary School, who were the stars of this and I think get a lot of credit. So high five, you guys. And I remember the director on this project, Lubna, telling me that she'd worked with kids at stage school who were not half as good as this. So they did a really good job. And I know that they practiced a lot before we turned up with the cameras and got filming. And also because a lot of what we do at Regen Media seems to be focused around case studies, I'm working on something for 2017 that will help you promote your new energy efficient building. Because of course, that's a lot of what we want to do. We want to make sure that you get the most out of it so that more people consider building this way. So something coming for 2017 at Regen Media, if that's you constructing and you want to then get yourself some publicity for that. Over the coming years, I hope to bring you a variety of in-depth case studies in the hub. We've had Long Barrow, we followed Alex on his journey, and we're just starting up with the next one now, which is why I'm chatting to architect Janet Cotterell. She's author of the Passive House Handbook, founder of the HPH151 system that we'll be talking about in this episode. We spoke to her in episode 121, but she's back today to talk through what will be happening at Buckinghamshire Passivhaus, how it all evolved. And as this site had an existing home on it, that's how we begin. I asked Janet how the project developed.
Well, I think they bought the property always thinking they would do it up because it's a replacement dwelling, basically, is what we're doing. And the existing dwelling on the site is not that beautiful, but it's a fantastic site. And I think the client's original intent was that they would retrofit it and go to the full passive house, which we did do a scheme to look at that.
How do you do that then in terms of getting all the detail? Because you didn't go down this route. So maybe you could explain what detail you went into and when you made that decision or how it came about.
We just did an initial study and I looked at how I would go about doing the walls, the roof, the main elements basically, and how we could also adapt it so that it would give them the accommodation they required. Interestingly, we could get the accommodation all right, very similar to the way we did the new house. But the issue was just the complexity of dealing with the existing fabric, which wasn't in great condition. So in the end, we reviewed it and agreed that it would be much easier to cost control for a start. And secondly, it would just give them a perfect house, with no compromises. And there is always the issue about replacing a house that isn't at totally the end of its life. But my feeling is it's so invasive doing a retrofit in any case that the fact that you are then replacing it and building something that will last for a very, very, very long time. My own position is that generally I would go for a replacement dwelling unless there was some particular architectural reason.
And you obviously, not only the Passive House handbook, you have that experience, but you've got the Totnes Passive House.
Yes.
And so maybe you could explain a little bit about that one. And, did that entail more than you were expecting? Did that one go exactly to plan? I mean, what were the lessons learned off that?
It did go to plan, but because it was actually also the first Passive House I did, it was incredibly invasive. I think that's what struck me. And there wasn't as much of the original fabric remaining as you might imagine by the time you've really upgraded everything. Obviously, we did use the existing footings. We did use the existing slab. We did use the basic walls on the ground, but everything else was stripped away. And I think that the issue is it was... Well, you can just see that it was a lot more time consuming. That's the thing. And the attention to detail for the contractor is much higher. So it is much easier for the contractor to achieve the Passive House standard on a new build. There's no doubt about it, because you can design out the complexity, basically. And interestingly, Adam, who owns the Totnes B&B, if it hadn't been a planning constraint, he would have definitely replaced it. And interesting, from just a future housing provision need, you could have got 2 houses on that site if you'd done it new build, which would have lots of advantages at the moment when we desperately need houses and we need land. I mean, it's an interesting, conserving something often isn't that efficient in many ways. And I think he would have ideally liked to, and to have been able to rearrange it on the plot. But, still, we did. It's a lovely project, and, it is fully certified to the full standard.
That's it. I suppose you weren't even going for the retrofit standard. I've forgotten that. It was a Passive House standard.
Yes.
So coming back then to Buckinghamshire Passive House, there are other issues here. Maybe you can explain the one between VAT and how you can reclaim VAT. And that was a big economic benefit of new build.
Yes, I didn't mention that. That does make a huge difference. So if you imagine you've got 20% VAT on the retrofit and you've got 0 rated VAT on a new build house, it's a huge penalty for actually retaining your structure. I never understand it politically.
Well, I was going to ask you that. How long has it been like that for?
My entire career, it's always been that way, and people have mooted. I don't understand why they don't say put 5% VAT on everything. So, retrofit work and new build work was all rated at the same level. And then people would make choices purely on what is best for the site, rather than being swung one particular way or the other. Because of the VAT issue.
Well, I guess there's nothing we can do on that one except know about it and then go down that route. So coming back on to the site, have we mentioned all of the pros and cons in this process of doing an analysis of the retrofit, thinking about what we could have with new build? Because, of course, there are planning considerations alongside this, that it wasn't a foregone conclusion.
No, it wasn't a foregone conclusion. Although I try to just use common sense in these situations. I can't see any reason, when I look at a site, I think, is there any reason really that somebody shouldn't do this? And then you have to make the planning arguments to the planners, really. So you have to be confident about what you're doing. Quite often you end up having to make quite strong arguments about what you're doing. But generally, I find we get there. We get there. It's just, frustratingly, it can often be longer and cost maybe a little bit more for the client to make the arguments, which is very frustrating for the client and delays things. But generally, we get there.
What did you have on the brief for this one?
It was a fairly straightforward brief. There was a certain amount of accommodation they wanted. But that's very easy. Most people building a house know what accommodation they desire. And then it really was Passive House. They wanted the Passive House. There was a little bit of, at the beginning, the clients were nervous about achieving the Passive House. And that is one of the things, if you're a self-builder and you want to do Passive House, you can't, it's not one of those things where you can guarantee you'll get it because of the challenge of doing it. So the client is often trying to minimise their risk. and to find a solution that is going to optimise their likelihood of achieving it, which is why we did what we do, which is do the timber frame system. We're trying to de-risk it all. And I think that is what appealed as well in the end. I think, they went round and looked at what was on. They were very efficient at going around looking at what was available, and risk was an issue, I think, for them, and they wanted to minimise that. And they saw what we were offering. And the fact that I'd done it before and got there, obviously, that's you're de-risking, aren't you, by having somebody with experience.
Also on the brief, or what I found quite interesting when I chatted to you before about this, was that they almost left the aesthetics to you and the outside. It was very much, okay, the inside, it will have a kitchen, diner space that will be the centre of the house. Perhaps as outdoorsy people, they wanted a special area to go from inside to outside. So all the things that you might expect on any brief, but then to leave that door open. So how did you go down that route? I know sometimes constraints really help, but did you have any constraints in that respect on this site?
I think as an architect, you're often responding to the site more than you are to the client. That's not quite true, because some clients have very specific ideas what they like and dislike. But actually, it is the site that you respond to, and in this case, it definitely was the site. So I was trying to. It's a beautiful site, and looking at the area around the site as well. If you go around the vicinity of the plot, you'll see that often there are houses, but they're in the centre of the plot, not on the street edge. So I wanted to get it back to more in keeping with what the surrounding area was like, the character of the surrounding area, which again is a planning, that's a strong planning argument as well. And just to address the plot, I think if you've got a plot, you want to make the most of the views, you want to make most of the sun. For me, that's very important, to get the orientation correct and to maximise what the site offers you.
Obviously, if you set it back, you've got things like driveways to consider. You can do whatever you want with it. But where did it end up then? Because the plot theoretically is quite large. It's over an acre. So you could have had it anywhere. How do you decide the exact position, or is this back to planning?
So if you look at the site, there is actually, by centering it in the site, basically, you maximise the views, and you divide the plot into different sections, which they're going to treat slightly differently. So we decided different areas could be treated in different ways, which would be quite attractive. And then I wanted to create that feeling of coming into a courtyard. So there's a long brick wall, for example, which is buttressed in a traditional way, which will go into the house. It sort of meets the house, and it creates the separation between a private and public space. But it starts to create this courtyard, and with the garages, there's a double oak garage, and that will start to embrace a space that will feel courtyardy and you don't want that space to get too big, because you lose a sense of containment, but you don't want it to be too mean either. So you're thinking about all those things when you set. There's a lot of things going on, but often the site tells you what to do. Interestingly, if when you're puzzling with it, and all the different requirements that you're thinking about come together, and then you find a solution.
How would you describe it then, what you're looking at? We can obviously put some photos into the show notes, and we've got the full story unfolding in the hub. How would you describe the look of the building now? And then we'll start talking through some of the construction process.
Well, the look of the building is the external look of it. So the finishes of the walls, roofs, are very much dictated by the design guide, the local council design guide, and they have one of the most developed design guides that I've seen, actually, because it covers the Chilterns area, basically.
In a good or bad way, or it just doesn't matter?
Well, I think it's good in the sense it is quite clearly done, and they're trying to keep a certain sort of aesthetic going. Where it would be a problem is, I don't think there's any problem in doing very modern designs, and you just want it to be of a certain quality, and then it becomes frustrating. So that's the negative side of it. But in this case, they weren't really worried, and I was interested anyways about doing a traditional looking UK aesthetic house, because of the fact that Passivhaus has been weak in that area because it's come from Europe. So it has a look some people like, but it's very subjective, and a lot of people, it's not a natural look for them, So I wanted to go with that look and go for that sort of traditional, play with it, basically. And I thought that would be a positive for Passivhaus.
How does it all start to come together then?
In terms of the design,
Yeah, the design and then lead on to, because we're on site at the moment.
well, always the first phase is getting that design and then getting it through planning. And then often people underestimate what is still to do. There is a huge amount of work still.
What's in the middle, Janet?
Yeah, exactly. It's the middle bit. So people get the idea of planning and design, and they very much get the idea of the construction because you see it. But there's a middle section that people don't often understand has to go on, which is all the working drawings, all the tender documents. And so for Passive House, as with any house, you generally would be doing, hopefully, proper construction detail drawings of how all the bits are going together and what they're made of. And you're getting building control approval usually at that stage. So that's the technical approval. So you've got your design approval from planning, but you're then going for your technical approvals from building control. And
this falls on you to do this, or how do you manage it in your business?
Well, when I was a bigger practice, before I did Passive House, I was a bigger architectural
that's
practice.
interesting.
Yeah. When I decided to go down the Passive House route, I completely slimmed right down because I used to end up doing a lot of just trying to get work and managing people. Now I do.
Sounds like a business, doesn't it?
Yeah. So now, because we've been building up this Passive House construction system and thinking how we're going to the business is going to play out, I've been trying to do everything myself. Because that's the way to get it right and work out all the processes and tweaks. So at the moment, I'm doing all that. Yeah, I'm generally, or actually, I work with Jonathan, as you know, and Jonathan does detailing as well. He's a contractor, so that's quite interesting because that relationship works very well when it comes to actual construction detailing.
So it sounds like there's a lot of time in there. How many days would you put aside to get it done?
I would want to have at least a couple of months normally to do that work.
And you revise it, do you, again, that sort of thing?
Well, what we've been doing at the moment, because we are trying to not keep reinventing the wheel. So this idea that we've got this timber frame, Passive House compliant solution, we're wanting to have details that we can also pass on to other people. And so we're just tweaking that. We are tweaking them because we're building and then we're adapting. But we've actually I think we've got to a point now where most of it works really well.
In terms of these details, how often, you've mentioned about reinventing the wheel, but how often is it a case of almost pulling them out of your archive and starting again?
Not starting again, no, only tweak. So we've now got details for everything. And actually, at the moment, we've got a pack of stuff that's just gone to WARM certifiers for Passive House, and they're going to be doing the SI values. That's the thermal bridge values for each of those principal details. So if you were going to use our frame system, you would actually be able to say, okay, if I build it like this and I install my window like this, this is the thermal bridge, and it'll be proven, so you would just bang it into your PHPP. So it's trying to simplify it for everybody because each of those thermal bridge details probably cost you £300. So you don't want to be going off-piste and doing all these things because it's just adding cost to your build.
And this is also an attractive side you talked about earlier of when you're building new, some of these costs, but affordability as well. It is.
Yeah, it is. The challenge is actually not so much to do the grand design. The challenge is to bring Passive House to an affordable level. And the way you've got to do that is partly you've got to have details that people can use. This pack of details we sent, which is basically for a house, isn't it? Because you're doing the ridge, you're doing the window. You've got to think every window detail you did, you'd have to do the reveal and the sill separately, because that's separate. You'd have to do the door separately. You'd have to do the floor to the wall, the intermediate floor, the ridge, the eaves. So you might have a dozen details. Now you can find, there are details that you can find. There's the standard EBO book, which I'm sure people probably come across, and it's come from Europe, and they have different details, but they're not generally not very UK-friendly details, and they're very simplified, and they give you an idea of the SI value, the thermal bridge value, and I've used those, and they have been really helpful, but it's not the same as having, I'm using that detail, and it is this, and you know it.
Yes.
So the only way you can get round that, if you were doing your self-build, and you didn't want to pay that money, you basically have to over-design because the certifiers will say, okay, we'll allow you to use this thermal bridge because we know it's not going to be worse than that. But if you want to gain by getting the best benefit from the detail that you've done, you've got to prove it. and that means you've got to calculate it. So what we're trying to offer to people is say, we'll use this system, and then you can have it absolutely, that is like our intermediate wall, floor to wall is thermal bridge free. Well, you want to have that benefit, don't you, when you put it into your PHPP? So that's the point, and our ridge detail is thermal bridge free. And I think one or two of others will be maybe even negative. That means you can get a positive benefit from the detail as well.
Right, Janet, you're over architecturing me, and I'm gonna bring it back to the project in the hope that I start to understand things again. But don't worry, this happens frequently. Back on site then, I've seen it myself, the big hole that's been dug, but maybe you could lead us through what needs to happen before you can start putting up the system.
On this site, what needs to happen? So this is a slight variation in that we've got two different contracting teams. So we've got a below ground works doing a basement, which is a German company called Glatar, who have a UK section of their company. And then we have the timber frame above ground works. The contractors who are doing the above ground works don't have to do any footings. They don't have to do a slab. So basically that handover point is the critical thing, which is always critical anyway. So even if it was all done under one contracting team, the handover from the groundworks, which is always concrete and blockwork and that sort of stuff, which is very different from the above ground work, which is all timber and carpentry and boards and tapes. So even if it was a single contractor, you'd often have a subcontractor doing the groundworks because it's a different set of skills. So that handover between the groundworks package and the above groundworks is actually really important. And it's important at Passive House, and the way we do the build is because we want the slab to be the airtight layer.
The slab not right down at the bottom. Or no, that probably is right down at the bottom.
Yeah, right at the bottom, the ground slab. So the concrete ground slab, which is
underground or on the ground? Sorry, just to clarify.
Well, I suppose it's on the ground, but it's certainly sitting on the ground generally. So it's the solid ground, usually about 150 mil thick, and it sits on the insulation.
But the basement is airtight and within the thermal envelope.
On this project, we've got a ground slab, and it's the lid of the basement.
Right. Okay,
in a typical build, it would be sitting on the ground, but it's a slab. It's a concrete 150 mil, say, thick thing, and that is what we are then building off. In a conventional timber frame, I think they have plus or minus 10 mil they go to that you can do across the slab and still get away with putting what's called the floor plate. Is what goes down first, and then the main frame goes up. So the floor plate it needs to be fairly flat for it. So I've never done a conventional timber frame because I used to do brick and block. But I having looked at the regulation or the general advice, it's plus or minus 10, whereas we try to do plus or minus 3. At most, plus or minus 5 you might get away with. So they've got to do that slab to a better standard than they would normally be doing. So that needs to be managed. And then before the frame arrives, you want to check it is actually to that standard and it is handed over to that tolerance.
So let's rewind. You're obviously designing the frame as part of what you do, and we're hoping to go and see it being made. So can you fill in that area there?
We are, Passive House Homes is designing and cutting the frame and delivering it to site. But in terms of the groundworks or the foundation, it's always you're in the mercy of, that is just traditional, somebody on site, contractor is making that, and we're just monitoring it. If I'm involved, if someone, now another project you could have covered, there's another architect doing it and we're just providing the frame, that's a different situation. So we just need to advise them. But the architect, whoever the architect, in this case I am the architect, but if it was another architect, they would have to be managing that slab and checking it and doing the handover and making sure it was right. And we'd be saying to them, you need to make sure that this surface is to this sort of standard, because you're getting a precision cut timber frame. This is not just something someone's, if you imagine, it's all of those pieces are coming to site. I think we worked out there was 500 or 600 pieces. That's a lot of pieces coming to site, and they're all cut and they all have to fit together. And you can't start on a wobbly base. It's as simple as that. You can't start on a wobbly base.
That's why you've got to get the foundations right.
Yeah.
So those 500, 600 pieces, is that, you're saying what the architect does is separate to, I know you're doing all of it in this, so it gets a bit confusing, but that would just go off to Passive House Homes and then they would come up with all the elements?
Yeah, so at the moment we're working with an architect called Peter Rankin, for example. Well, we're just doing a quote for them, actually. So he's done the design for 2 passive houses. And then what we're doing there is saying we will supply the shell, and we will design it as in the frame will be designed, it will be structurally calculated, it will be cut, it will then arrive on site. And in that case, it might be or might not be either we would arrange for someone to erect it or the main contractor would erect it with some training.
I think what's going to be interesting about this is we can probably almost bring this to a close now, because we hope to catch up with you a couple of times as the project goes on. So this is quite a good point to leave it, that we've got these plans, we've got the frame, and maybe once I have seen the frame cut and seen what they get delivered, and we've got more to talk about.
Yeah, I think that would be a good point. And I just say, just so that people understand, at this point of before it goes on site, we've done a 3D frame drawing with all the timber bits.
Can you maybe just explain that bit again? I don't quite understand how you went from your designs, because an architect wouldn't be designing in the timber frame, or would they? They just...
No. So we would see a house design, plans and elevations. And really, if we were advising an architect who wanted to use a system, we'd be saying you need to have the walls so thick. We'd probably a little bit more information than that, but for very few guidelines, they could be designing their house so that it would be okay to build out of a timber frame. So then as long as the wall is that thickness, then we would then take it and we would be designing the frame to fit into that house design. Basically, we're designing it for your house, whatever you decided, really, we would make it work. And then when you see our drawings, it is just the frame, all the elements of the timber frame, the lintels, the beams, and we do it in 3D so that you can spin it and have a look at it. And then each of those elements gets transposed just into almost like an Excel sheet. It's not an Excel sheet, but of the length and width and the angles that are to be cut. And and I can't remember what the software is called, but it goes into this bit of software that the cutter understands. And this is where we're going to have a look, which will be interesting. This humdinger saw then takes all this information, and if you were willing to have it all delivered to site just as it was most efficient, the humdinger will work out how to cut all those pieces in the least waste. So it will literally go through and sort out all those pieces. It's actually amazing. And it will you'll end up with a tiny little pile of no waste at all. But we have a little more of a puzzle, because we've got to try and deliver it to the builder so that they unpack it in a sequence that makes sense. So that's quite an interesting issue. So they will get a number of packs. Say they get, 15 packs or maybe 20 packs. They want those packs to go sequentially through. So the humdinger then, that's one of the things we've been recently doing, working out how we can make the humdinger cut them out in sections so that it gets packed up in sections. So you only unpack pack 1 and pack 2 and do the ground floor walls, and then you unpack pack 3 and pack 4, and then you do the next. It's all and of course it's slightly more wasteful doing that, but it's still incredibly less wasteful than doing it on site. If you can imagine how much waste happens on site. So it's quite an interesting approach just from material waste. And it's a
balancing act, isn't it, as well?
It's a balancing act. You're balancing all different needs out. But the factor also, which we'll see when we go, and I'm interested in seeing, is, of course, the waste is being created at the factory. So where they are making the iJoy. So that will all definitely get recycled. Because I'm always suspicious on sites when they have the recycling stuff, whether this is really full circle going back. But if you can create the waste at the actual factory, you know for certain it's all going to be done properly, don't you? So it's a very pleasing sort of circle of producing the frames, I think.
Well, let's leave it there. Absolutely brilliant. Always a pleasure to chat to you. But yeah, I think we need to pick up the story again a few months down the road. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/151. You can review the key points, take a look at some plans for the house and see the progress on site so far. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, scroll down to the bottom and you can type it in there. We'll link to Janet, to CTT Sustainable Architecture and to Passive House Homes, all in the show notes, houseplanninghelp.com/151. And if you're a hub member, well, of course, you can go and watch the videos unfold. We try and load a new one in every month, and that's in addition with everything else. If you're not a hub member, maybe I should give you the overview first of all. I feel that there's quite a lack of support for self-builders. There's lots of information that you can find here, there, and everywhere online, and probably a few forums that you can go into, but nowhere where you feel like people are helping you out and you're getting to know them as well. So it's a community for self-builders, very interested in building low energy homes. We've got our closed Facebook group. We've got the progress calls, which are audio only. Although after the last one we did, I'm thinking at some point we will definitely switch to video because it makes sense, doesn't it? We're talking about buildings. We should really be looking at plans, talking through all those sorts of things. But for now, keep it simple. Get everyone in on the call, hear about their projects, hear what struggles they're having and whether we can solve any of those. And it's often surprising, even with a small group of people together, there's a lot of knowledge. And I think we could all feel that when we're in one of these calls. We've got the modules which try it and lay it out step by step. We're trying to improve those as well and to make them easier to consume. The video case studies, obviously, we've mentioned that a lot today in the chat with Janet. And if you haven't seen the video walkthrough, then perhaps this is the time to go and have a look. If you're not a member or perhaps you've been sitting on the fence, houseplanninghelp.com/join. The other benefit of joining today is, of course, you get locked in at the current price because every so often we put the price up and we're approaching one of those price increases in the next few weeks. houseplanninghelp.com/join. Thank you so much for being there. Always appreciated. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.